have a great pleasure today to discuss this topic with two experts who bring substantial experience and expertise in this field. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Joy Kim, who's been working in the area of macroeconomic and environmental policies for over 20 years now. In her work, she focuses on public finance, including fiscal policy for sustainability. She is a Senior Economic Affairs Officer at UNEP, leading fiscal policy for sustainable development work. And we have with us Mr. Khalid Hamid, who has spent over 30 years working in the specialized area of public sector auditing. Mr. Hamid has recently become the International Director at the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, where he supports the increasing professionalization of finance management within the public sector. So something that's very relevant for the work of auditors, public auditors. Let's start now with the first section on our discussion panel. And this is about understanding the basics. My first question goes to Dr. Kim. Could you please discuss the main advantages of using taxation as a tool for the green transition?
Thank you very much for the question, Joanna, and good afternoon and good morning, colleagues. Taxation is a powerful tool for promoting green transitions as it directly influences economic behavior through price incentives. In the current economic system, unfortunately, market price is misaligned, not correctly reflecting the true cost of using natural resources or the externalities of economic activities. So by implementing taxes, governments can in fact discourage the use of environmentally harmful products or services or such behaviors while incentivizing more sustainable alternatives. For instance, carbon pricing, including carbon taxations, has proven to be very effective in several countries, as they actually embed the cost of climate impact in the price of fossil fuels. Additionally, taxes on single-use plastic, for instance, has also led to a significant reduction of plastic waste, showcasing how such fiscal instruments can be aligned with environmental objectives. Another example is a taxes on chemicals pollution, which can provide a strong incentive to innovate in the search for cleaner alternatives. Having said that, there are also situations where such market-based instruments like taxations may not be most appropriate. For instance, when the health and environmental cost of using certain chemicals is very high or is difficult to assess, or when the effect of using certain chemicals is very location-specific, then such market instruments should be considered as more complementary instruments rather than replacing strong bans or the restrictions.
Well, thank you very much for discussing the advantages of green taxation and also pointing out to the situation where taxation could be less appropriate. I've got a follow-up question for you, and this is about specific examples of successful green taxation initiatives you've encountered in your work.
A notable example is Sweden, which has really been a pioneer in introducing carbon taxations since 1990s. And this carbon taxation in Sweden has not only helped reducing carbon emissions, but also it has helped stimulating technological innovations and green energy solutions in Sweden, which has contributed also to Sweden being a global leader when it comes to sustainability issues. Another excellent example is British Columbia in Canada, which has also introduced the carbon taxations while maintaining economic neutrality, which implies that they have redistributed fully the revenues from carbon taxations, also through by reducing other taxes for the businesses and households, which actually turn out to be very effective.
Well, these are indeed impressive examples. Thank you very much. I'm now turning with my next question to Mr. Hamid. Mr. Hamid, from your extensive auditing background, what have you observed about the effectiveness of taxation or subsidy strategies for environmental initiatives, and that in conjunction with direct spending and regulation? And what, in your view, tends to be the focus, and what types of messages are supreme audit institutions delivering?
Good day, Joanna and Dr. Joy and everybody. I just wanted to dwell on the question, which is really around the role SAIs are playing in this very complex space. And just to first of all take a step back and say, how does the SAI interface and touch these issues in its operations and its strategic approach to how it looks at the issue of environmental taxation subsidy? The first thing to take into consideration, which brings complexity for the SAI, is the actors in government to whom these processes can relate. So you may have an environmental dimension, so an environmental protection agency, many jurisdictions could be leading some of the thought leadership and initiatives and policy initiatives, but the implementation may sit with a specific institution, or it may sit, for example, within the revenue authorities. So you have at the moment a certain area of accountability where the traditional audit sphere has always been to have an issue related to somebody accountable and in that space. And so immediately we're already hitting the integrated thinking and integrated policy making and policy coherence. There is a challenge for SAI. And that's something that we really need to take in the opportunity of this subject matter into the space of how SAIs process information when it cuts across different jurisdictions within a locality. So one of the things that we see with the SAIs when they are looking at these areas is you will often see an initiative of, for example, setting up a carbon taxation body, a monitoring or regulatory body. And what they'll do often in the reports that we see is an evaluation of the effectiveness of the administration. So before we get to the impact and the outcome of the effectiveness of taxation policy that Dr. Joy was explaining, the first thing is to say, has it been implemented properly, and do we have an effective system of internal control over the process that we're managing? And that the messages that come out from that is there are a lot of challenges and teething problems with information, because it's coming across different dimensions in different areas. You're looking at environmental information, you're also looking at financial information. And so the operability of systems, or the interoperability of systems, and the way in which organizations and jurisdictions make the rules and regulations creates its natural complexity. And a lot of these, and I think this is something we're going to see over the next 5-10 years, are structural. So the structural challenges in how government proceeds to look at taxation subsidies in across the different dimensions, and where you have to start having more integrated thinking and integrated management of data is one of the messages we're getting. The other clear recommendations that are coming from SAIs in this space is the challenge, again, and something I may touch on a couple of times, of those, and examples Dr. Joy gave again, of Canada, Sweden, those countries in the OECD-linked countries or the more advanced economies tend to do these things and be able to do them. But where the challenge is with people who have less capacity, because the sophistication of this and the need for this to be done by all is paramount. But we're in danger of making strong stronger and the weak weaker if we don't find a way in which this can be brought out and brought across to other jurisdictions. I'm looking at initiatives that INTOSAI has run, such as the climate scanner now. And the climate scanner is trying to take an initiative to have a global thought across a process, but that's just for data collection and transparency. What we're discussing here is effectiveness. And that is something that we really need to understand in the frame of what can we do now, because there's no time, and what must we do to make this process go forward. So I think that there is work done. But the other thing I would just point out in this space is this area of green taxation and subsidies compared to spending programs, gets less scrutiny. And I think it's an interesting fact that it's easier to take a program that's a flagship program of climate adaptation or other things, which is perfectly valid. But for the significance of taxation on the economics of the country, the scrutiny the SAI is giving it is not proportional, I think. So the one thing that would be very much encouraged would be to start looking at this issue much more extensively and intensively from the SAI perspective. I can stop there and pass back to you, Joanna.
Yes, thank you very much. You've listed quite a number of aspects and challenges here that are very relevant for the work of public auditors. So thank you very much for that. We could now move forward to section 2 of our discussion and take a deep dive into challenges and solutions. My next question is to Dr. Kim from UNEP. From your experience, from UNEP's experience, what long-term enablers do you believe are most critical when it comes to the success of green taxation reforms?
Thank you very much. The most critical long-term enablers include 3 components. One is the robust policy frameworks. Second is a public acceptance. And then third one is a governmental transparency to avoid any challenges associated with political economy issues. It is essential for governments to frame these efforts of pricing environmental harms rather than taxation per se, as often the optic of the word taxation or taxes tend to hinder progress. And public acceptance and public engagement also hold the key to the success of implementing a green taxation. For instance, environmental taxations tend to be regressive, impacting the most vulnerable members of society in general. So understanding the distributional impact of such taxations and having the mitigation measures in place tends to increase a high level of public acceptance. And having well thought through communication strategy is also crucial to have a successful public engagement. And finally, transparent reporting and accountability also play a very important role in ensuring broad public compliance and support.
Well, yes, thank you very much for pointing out in your answer also to the challenging consequences of the introduction and implementation of environmental taxation. I have got a follow-up question for you, Dr. Kim, here, and that's about lessons learned. What lessons have we learned from various global attempts to implement such policies?
One key lesson learned is the importance of designing a policy that is well sequenced and communicated, ensuring a public buy-in before the reforms are implemented. The case of the Gilets jaunes protest in France has demonstrated that the repercussions of failing to do so by increasing the fuel taxes in a short period of time without sufficient warning to the stakeholders who are most affected by that taxes. The protests were also partly triggered by the sudden fuel tax increase perceived as unfairly burdening the working and the middle classes. This actually highlights again the importance of addressing political economy issues and actively involving stakeholders that are most affected by such changes through green taxations.
Yes, thank you very much for discussing these lessons learned. It's important to be aware of them. Let's talk now about the policy impact or evaluating the policy impact. Mr. Hamid, in your experience, in terms of policy impacts, what are the key challenges in evaluating the effectiveness of taxation measures for the green transition?
It's a very broad and far-reaching question, but it's also a very broad and far-reaching area of scrutiny. So just to break it down into, first of all, the policy formulation, and I think it was also Dr. Kim was saying the actual policy framework on which you're basing everything needs some kind of evidence base. It needs some kind of scrutiny, and that requires multidisciplinary thinking. And this multidisciplinary thinking at the moment is relatively new in terms of the space that people are now seeing that there are trade-offs, there are difficult decisions that need to be taken, and therefore all different actors need to be brought into that space. So the first challenge is understanding the formulation of any framework and how it was evidenced and who was involved. And that actually, again, is, I think, relatively new thinking. I think if we take this, I keep saying it, in the 21st century, if we think about managing information, we think about integrated thinking, all of these come directly to this area. And because you have these different viewpoints and a new culture of activism, the second issue that was made about public perception and public engagement and acceptance, I think it's very fundamental. If you're going to, even before you think about the policy impact effectiveness, if you don't get that right, policy, even if it's the best policy, will fail. And so one of the things that also then strikes me, and again, maybe slightly controversially, is therefore the policy responsible person or body has to have the skills and the competencies and the strengths and powers then to take this forward. And one of the things I'm seeing in different jurisdictions is capture of those policy regulators, not just in the environmental space, but in other spaces. And this is where the need for that to act without fear or favour and have the right competencies and people becomes so profound. And at the moment, if you've got very, very deep pockets of industry and other actors that can obviously and have access to more research, etc., that can then challenge governments, you get into a situation where the regulatory aspect of the process is not going to be appropriate. And then the third issue that was raised was the issue of transparency and the accountability over that process, which is where traditionally we sit as in the SAI space, is looking at the purpose of, is it the right things being told to the people in a way they can understand, and has there been any consequences of failures to act? So even in these environments such as Canada, for example, if you go back to the Commissioner of Sustainable Development, they've been reporting, even now, they don't think the 2030 target is going to be met. They have to report at the end of 24, but even now they've done an early warning system saying they don't see these targets being met. But the so what and the consequences of that are not being seen or put in place. And that's before you get to the even more challenging issue of taxation measures, because of the complexity of taxation measures, not simply a spending program, but again, as I said earlier on, the far-reaching impact of taxation measures, how fundamental they are, should not be underestimated. But then we have the challenge of, well, there's two challenges there. The first challenge from the SAI point of view is SAIs, and this is a discussion within the SAI community, is that they can question the implementation of policy, but not policy itself. And so there is a political dimension to this before we get to the implementation. So what is the boundary as to what SAIs can look at in this space? If I choose a certain path as a government in a certain lever, policy lever I'm following, if it was a wrong policy lever, do I have the right to question that? So that's something that it might be interesting to get other perspectives on that. And then the second issue, as I said, is where is the accountability? Is the accountability in the administration of the process, or is it in the regulation of the process? And those two could be in different places. So you have a significant amount of opportunities for different variables that fall outside of a traditional linear performance audit. And so it's hard to formulate, because you may need a performance audit team that spans across different sectors. And I don't know how often that's done. I know there's some very good examples. If I look at the Inflation Reduction Act and the work the GAO is doing in America on looking at some of the incentives and areas, you've got obviously a very high performing organization, which I know is very generous with its time to the SAI. So there are those examples, but when it comes to the impact, which is at the end of the question about the transition, the green transition, and you look at examples of such as Germany and others, and the role played in actually transitioning and the accountability arrangements over there, there are some successes. But the role of the SAI in that space is something. Has it actually supported and enhanced, or has it? What's the level of effectiveness? That's another issue I would suggest is difficult to measure. To be fair to everybody in itself, so not only is this a difficult area, it's a difficult area to measure. It's difficult to measure the SAI's role as well. So I think that's in short, that's a response to the question, which I hope I broke down into the elements and then gave an understanding of each element of that.
Yes, indeed, that was a comprehensive response. Thank you. And thank you for pointing out two key challenges and for raising pertinent questions and at the same time suggesting solutions on how to tackle these challenges. I have now a bit more specific questions. You've mentioned that in your answer, but if we could elaborate a little bit specifically on administrative and enforcement challenges associated with green tax and other policies, other associated policies.
Yeah, I think if you're looking at the trade-offs that we talked about between the social, the environmental, and the economic, and the bodies who are responsible, because you'll find an environmental protection agency, you'll find a finance function within the Ministry of Economy or Ministry of Finance often is responsible for looking for the economy, and then within social justice there may be different actors working in that space. And so what you're trying to do here is trying to look at the objectives of each of them in terms of their own KPIs or whatever mechanism is used for key performance indicators, or whatever mechanism is used to evaluate the effectiveness of that regulatory body. And at the moment, I think that there is the Sustainable Development Goals is probably a very good example, and so is the European Union's climate disclosures, climate-related disclosures, and where you get the integration of the different elements of the three types of accountability, and four if you include governance, you can get yourself into hundreds of targets and hundreds of elements of monitoring and reporting. So, and again, it's that trade-off between those different elements and trying to answer the simple question, overall, are things getting better or worse? What we have now with the Paris Agreement, a very concrete target that we're looking at from the environmental point of view. But again, sadly, as soon as you get into things like the COPs and the discussions you'll see in the developing economies, which I mentioned earlier on, the fight against poverty can often override other elements in the process. And so I think that we've got examples, and unfortunate examples, where there are still fossil fuel burning and reliance on basic energies because of the attempt to fight poverty. And when you look at those jurisdictions, and I will say somewhere like South Africa right now is a very good example. What is the regulatory body on environmental protection doing in that space at the moment? And it's a very difficult place for them to be acting in line with that. And so it's about the resources going into those different aspects in those different areas. And at the moment, the regulatory capture issue I mentioned earlier on could also be by undercapacitating the regulatory body and the administration and enforcement, means you're not getting the information and therefore there's less scrutiny on it. And there's been examples of that. And then there's the final issue from an audit point of view as well, of trusting the data when it's scientific information or it's other information. We saw the Volkswagen scandal a few years ago, for example, where, even where there is enforcement, the tools and the skills needed to implement that is also a challenge in itself. I don't want to paint a negative picture at all. I'm trying not to, But unfortunately, these challenges we need to collectively look at and say, what are the minimum requirements we could have, rather than having higher requirements which can't be met. And this is if you also think about the small island developing states at the moment, in particular, and the support that they need. I think some of the multilateral agencies and banks have started realizing that there needs to be some simplified frameworks and things for reporting. But at this stage, I think the truth of the matter is that you get less sophistication the more the need.
Right.
I say that way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you've indeed listed quite a long list of challenges, but as you said, it's very important to be aware of them. You mentioned trade-offs, but I wanted to specifically ask you whether you think there are trade-offs in simplifying these policies to improve compliance.
So this is what I was saying. There's no point in setting the bar if you can't meet it. So the question is there a type of maturity scale based on the capacity of the relative environment and based on what's possible to start reporting something? Because if the old cliche, if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get attention. So I think that this idea of expecting Vanuatu to have the same standard of reporting as China or US, I think it's a difficult situation. So I think that simplification doesn't have to be across the board. As you're saying, for example, Sweden, US, UK can carry on, and they must. And it's important to have leadership. But at the same time, the need for ensuring the compliance is at the level where you may only have 2 or 3 people who are, have the scientific background to test the relevant areas of air pollution or water pollution or whatever. You need to make sure that that's what you're measuring, rather than saying you can't measure anything. So I think that there is definitely an objective there. And I think, whether you've seen this across different jurisdictions, you've seen this in the accounting disclosures. So now we're talking about the sustainable standards of reporting. Even now, one of the first things we're saying is we don't want a situation where we have to qualify loads of financial statements because there's no data available or the information can't be gathered. That's not helpful. So again, it's having that natural balance between what can be done and then trying to get people to aspire to improve from there.
Well, thank you very much for that. All points are very pertinent. We've arrived to section 3 of our discussion, where we would like to discuss practical considerations in tax policy. Dr. Kim, what is the role of international agencies in supporting member countries to enhance capacity to improve administration and enforcement of green policies?
Thank you for the question. I very much agree to what Mr. Khalid has said on the limited capacity in the developing world when it comes to the administration and enforcement capacity. When it comes to particularly green taxation. So in that context, I do believe that there is an important role that international agencies can play, particularly in terms of providing technical assistance and building their capacity, as well as facilitating knowledge sharing and good practices. So agencies such as UNEP, for instance, help countries to develop such institutional and technical capacities to effectively administer and then enforce green taxations. And this includes, for instance, training tax officials, improving technological infrastructures, and establishing frameworks for monitoring and evaluation. Additionally, international cooperation can also help in harmonizing the tax measures across borders to prevent trade imbalances and ensure global environmental benefits. So such cooperation could also facilitate sharing good practices and knowledges and lessons learned at the global level. In fact, at the global level currently, there are a few of such platforms that facilitate international cooperation on taxations. But at the UN level, the most recent efforts in this regard is to establish an ad hoc intergovernmental committee to develop a draft terms of references for a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. This has just started in last year, 2023, so it is very much under construction and preparation, but we very much look forward to the development of the terms of references for the Framework Convention, which hopefully can provide a very good guidance in terms of international cooperation on taxations in general, but including green taxations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim and Mr. Hamid, very much for your contributions to our discussion, listing numerous practical examples and pointing out to key challenges in evaluating the impact of taxation for green transition. That all has been very, very useful for the work of our project group and for the auditors from Supreme Audit institutions in general. Building upon these insights that you've delivered, we are eager to further explore the engagement of Supreme Audit institutions with auditing, reviewing, and evaluating the impact of taxation, tax credits, and subsidies for green transition. Thanks very much to everyone for watching.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.